I've never really been into a whole lot of Bungie's games. I've only played Destiny and I'm yet to play the Halo and the Master Chef, despite hearing a lot of good things about it. But I don't know, out of all the games that I want to play, their games tend to be near the bottom. Not for any particular reason, just there are other games I want to play before it. However, what I am intrigued by is Bungie themselves. Most people's perception of the company is those people who made Halo and Halo but Borderlands. So it's easy for myself and others to only think of the company as just that, and for a while that's what happened. No one really talked about Bungie pre-Halo, so it was easy to assume that the company just kind of spawned out of nowhere. But as I was doing my totally super analytical research like I always do, come on you guys, I ended up finding a game called Oni, a game by Bungie US, quite literally released months before Halo, and I was surprised. I mean, my first thoughts were, they made other games? Eventually, I learned that Bungie had made games like Myth and Marathon, which have a pretty small popular following. And so, I became intrigued. Here I was, almost discovering some hidden past that I didn't know about, and probably what a lot of people didn't know about either. And out of all the games, I was easily the most fascinated by Oni. Bungie actually had a small division before releasing Halo, simply known as Bungie West. During development, they were heavily inspired by the movie Ghost in a Shell, and so that influence seems to be very present from what I saw. The dystopian future setting and the slick hand-drawn anime style that they were going for in the intro impressed me a lot. I was very interested and, in many ways, was very excited to play the game. And hey, worst comes to worst, I could at least enjoy those beautiful cinematic cutscenes they had going. Only to find out that the game only had 2 of those cutscenes in the game. So, yeah. The year is 2032, and the world is under threat. The world is dangerously polluted, and crime is rampant throughout every city. The government has set up cities to protect civilians from the atmosphere. However, a mysterious terrorist group known as the Syndicate starts attacking many landmarks and public buildings. Led by a man with no past named Muro, the group appears to destroy and take over a city. Kanoko, a woman who works for the Technological Crimes Task Force, or TCTF, is assigned to stop these terrorists once and for all, and ultimately save the world. So, the story kinda sucks. I mean, the reason why I presented it in that whole "in the world" voice is because the story is very much treated like your typical 80s action movie, just kinda there for you to beat up terrorists, which is completely fine, but kinda disappointing as well. Especially since the game kind of starts off pretty vague and mysterious. A lot of the characters and the general world of Oni start off pretty interesting because we are just introduced to them and we don't know a whole lot about them. For instance, there's this scene with the characters Griffith and Dr. Kier, where they talk about how Kanoko is doing, using terms like Daodan latency, bioplasmic waveforms, how Kanoko is as much your creature as she is mine. Or this scene where Kanoko heads to a suspected supplier for the Syndicate, and you see this purple-haired dude named Muro, which you don't know much about other than he might be the leader of the Syndicate. So, in a weird way, the vagueness adds a lot to the story initially, but as the story continues, nothing is really added to it. It just continues to be really vague. However, that's not really something you learn until the last chapter of the game, when you actually find Muro's plans. And in between all of that is Kanoko basically going to other locations to stop the Syndicate from doing terrorist things. But through doing that, you don't really learn a whole lot about them. Like, you don't even know what their main goal is. They don't even have a manifesto. It's more like, haha, look at us, we are doing the bad. Even Kanoko pretty much writes in her diary, yo, what the fuck? Easily the most interesting thing that happens in the story is that Kanoko ends up going rogue, due to her becoming too powerful and knowing too much, which is pretty cliche, but it's a moment in the game when you learn something about her character and her past that makes her a lot more interesting. Kanoko is easily the best and most interesting character out of everyone. She actually has the personality compared to everyone else. Mainly, she wants to protect people and always wants to do the right thing, and through that, she comes across as determined, confident, yet caring for the innocent, always asking if she could do more to help and asking people who are hurt if they're alright. Although, she kind of enjoys killing, likes beating people up, and wants to inflict pain. But it's to protect others. It's fine, guys, don't worry. She's also kind of tortured herself. She knows nothing about her past, and so when it's brought up, she ends up becoming vulnerable and a bit sensitive even. She understandably gets upset at a lot of people from withholding this information about her past, which is what causes her to go rogue in the first place. In many respects, she's a very dynamic character that can surprisingly go through a lot of arcs. But then you get to characters like Griffith and Muro. Griffith just kind of barks orders at Konoko for her to do, but really says nothing and doesn't add anything besides being rude to Konoko later on. While it appears that he has a bigger role later on in the game, there really isn't much of a reason for him to have it. Really, the only personality trait I can give the dude is that he's an asshole. Muro is a dumb and stupid villain. His personality trait is edgelord, always monologuing, talking his, ugh, I'm so dark and mysterious voice, and tries to appear all tough despite sending his henchmen to do everything while fleeing away from Konoko. It's pretty bad, but also kind of funny, not going to lie. It's complicated, really. The game feels all over the place tonally. It's hard to ignore the fact that this game was inspired by Ghost in a Shell, a movie that's rich with symbolism and various themes, so it feels weird to say that the story can almost be dismissed entirely, which I don't know was intentional or not. Like, when you find out why Muro wants to be a terrorist, it's such a cliche action movie reason. It's hard not to laugh, and it's even hard to think that they wrote this without at least having some fun with it. Yeah, stuff is left out, and the story can feel vacant, abandoned, and not interesting, but I don't feel it was trying to be all that interesting or deep in the first place. I mean, it's a game where you beat up terrorists with superpower moves and laser guns. Hell, there are a lot of scenes where it's obviously trying to be funny and comedic. I just think that the story was meant so that the player could just have fun with it. Really, if anything, I would imagine that the Ghost in the Shell influence was probably more in the overall aesthetic of the game, with adopting the dystopian cyberpunk setting, and Konoko pretty much being Motoko Kusanagi, aka the Major. While the story does have its serious parts, it's something that wouldn't be too out of place in a Mission Impossible movie or an old Bond film. So yeah, story is bad, but it cool, fam. It's a semi-serious but also pretty funny action movie, and so in many respects, it's really only there for you to sit back and chill out. So it's all good in my opinion. Although something that absolutely needs to be brought up is the visuals. It's pretty bad. I mean, it's not unbearable. I'd still beat the game, but geez, man. I don't know why it looks this way. Oni was originally on PC and was ported to the PS2 later by Rockstar Toronto, which Rockstar is usually good about handling many of their games, but I don't know what it was about Oni. I get sometimes the quality of a PC release is drastic compared to a console version, but there are a ton of fantastic looking games on the PS2 and the PS1, so I don't really see how this could be a hardware limitation. Here's the PC version of Oni. The color is bright and pops, the saturation is beautiful, it looks very crisp and has a lot of color variation. This area in Chapter 2 feels more interesting to explore because of how the visuals look. The white walls that surround the building add a lot to the futuristic setting of the game. The machinery looks a lot more neat and absorbing with the dark bright reds and the tinted light greens. There's a lot more of an atmosphere to the building with how clean the walls and floor look, and the vibrant white transparent smoke coming out of the vents. It gives the idea that this location is efficient and tidy, yet looks ahead of its time. It's really pretty. Now here's the PS2 version. As you see, there's a slight difference. I don't know where to begin with this. Well, for starters, the saturation looks completely thrown off. Colors aren't looking what they should be looking like. It comes across as bland and not nearly as vibrant as the PC version. It looks like the screen is constantly blurry and muddied, so it ends up making the saturation looking even worse, with everything looking very meshed together. Not only that, but the visuals also look very dark, like someone turned the brightness down or someone added more shadows or whatever. Like, here's this part in Chapter 5 on the PC version. Shadows are implemented really nicely, but aren't too overwhelming to where you can't see the surroundings in its entirety. The way the shadows seem to caress the walls in the background provides scenery that not only highlights the area you're in, but in a way that the background doesn't stick out too much. The PS2 version, on the other hand, yeah. There's a lot of what I just said earlier present in this as well, but with the darkness almost seemingly engulfing the area. It ends up making the level look really poorly designed visual-wise. It feels like you're not seeing everything, and so you can't really begin to take in the environment because of that. That, and combined with the poor vibrancy of colors and the blurry look that it has for whatever reason, the visuals end up looking really bad, and it can be kind of hard to look at sometimes. It's definitely not the worst looking game, but it's disappointing. I mean, looking at how the PC version looks visually, many of the game's areas, buildings, and levels look way more interesting than the PS2 version does. It conveys more of that Ghost in the Shell aesthetic Bungie was going for. You see the crisp greens of computer screens, red light illuminates more properly, and many places look very clean, slick, and futuristic, even using basic geometric shapes and stuff like doors. It subtly adds to the world that Oni presents. I admire a lot more with how the levels were initially designed and how pretty they were originally. I can imagine more what these places are like, despite the presence of Syndicate troops. It makes me appreciate the game more now that I know it doesn't look garbo in the PC version. But sadly, the PS2 version does look bad. I couldn't admire the levels as much as I would have, which is unfortunate because the PC version looks great. So having that kind of quality, or of quality similar to the PC version, would have been really beneficial for the PS2 version. But sadly, that is not the case. It is vgarbo. I feel I am being too negative about Oni, which isn't really the impression I want to give, because without a doubt, easily the best thing about Oni is its gameplay. Oni is quick to be labeled as a third-person shooter or a beat-em-up, which is fair, and I see why it's labeled as such, but I don't feel that best represents the game, mostly because Oni is an action game that controls and is mechanically a lot like a fighting game. While the default control setup can be weird at first, you quickly get used to it and you understand why it was designed the way it is. R1 is used to punch/shooting, R2 is to crouch, while triangle is to drop the weapon, square is to reload your weapon, circle is to use hypos, this game's healing item, and X is to interact or taunt. You can also block by not hitting a button or moving backwards when an enemy is attacking you. I like how its usage of the buttons is complementary to similar actions. Like punch and kick are all on the right side of the controller, while movement is entirely based on the left side, and the X, circle, square, and triangle buttons are all used for miscellaneous reasons. Which, yeah, all this seems weird for a game that mechanically is a lot like a fighting game. But Oni and its levels are designed like an action game, which make these control inputs a lot of sense in my opinion, since you're not dealing with the usual side camera that you see in many other fighting games. Your movement and the space that you are in is all based around it being three-dimensional. Not only that, but fighting games usually have multiple buttons to perform various moves and combos, since the movement is relative to the side point of view fighting games typically have. It would be hard to implement that kind of control scheme into a third-person action game, in which combat is relative to a third-person perspective and an open environment. Well, open relative to a fighting game, I mean. So the control setup is actually kind of smart in many ways, adjusting it slightly to have it work in an efficient manner while also accompanying the action game layout that the game has. That's not to say you can't change the controls, by the way. You can choose different configurations depending on what you want, but personally, some changes are weird, like how R1 is to interact with items or how triangle is to crouch. It's a bit weird in my opinion, but it's there if you need to change it. Although, you might be wondering how Oni is like a fighting game at all, beyond the hand-to-hand combat. After all, Oni really only has a punch and a kick, and most fighting games usually have more attacks than just that. Like, Tekken uses low, mid, and high attacks, for instance, and Soul Edge/Soul Calibur uses horizontal and vertical attacks. While, yes, that is true, there's more to Oni's combat beyond just using the punch and kick. Kanoko can use a variety of moves and combos, usually learning a new one every chapter as the game progresses. Specifically, there are 11 of them, if you aren't counting default ones like throws, a disarm one, or a slide. But what's really great about how the combos are used is that all of them are effective and work really well, even really simplistic ones like hitting the punch button 3 times. You actually have to use these combos and moves in an efficient way, not only dodging and blocking at appropriate times, but knowing when to hit the enemies since they can also block and even have powerful attacks of their own. As said earlier though, I can understand why people might use the beat 'em up label, as the enemies in Oni are pretty easy to defeat. Which is kind of expected, although it can feel pretty mindless. Sometimes I felt like I was just kind of walking through enemies without really trying, but then there were some scenarios requiring me to think more about what's going on. So it can feel a lot like a beat 'em up without really playing like one mechanically speaking. But this kind of leads into a problem with the pacing at times, because Oni is definitely not a game that I could personally play in long sessions. The combat feels simplified, despite it being pretty complex. So with enemies being easy to defeat, the game can get quite boring after a while. That's not to say the game isn't fun at all. That would be a massive understatement. I mean, constantly sliding into dudes, throwing people in midair, using Kanoko's abilities to absolutely devastate enemies like her Devil Spin Kick or Crescent Moon Kick is really fun. Not only that, but there are so many guns in this game, it's kinda ridiculous. Like, you have your typical pistol and light machine guns, but you also have a sniper rifle that shoots solid mercury, a mortar that shoots out grenades, and a rocket launcher that fires multiple rockets all at once. Which all these are extremely fun to use, and using these weapons feels very satisfying, especially when you see how it absolutely levels a group of enemies. The combat is extremely fun because you're exposed to all these different forms of combat, and so you're always constantly fighting dudes in a varied manner. Furthermore, since you're constantly fighting, you feel pretty awesome going through what can be a massive wave of enemies, only for you to come out on top. And hey, punching dudes is fun, so there's that. But it becomes an issue when you do this over a long period of time. Since the enemies are pretty easy to beat, you kinda get burned out after a while of doing the same thing over and over, even with the variety of combat choices for you. It's just that sometimes there really isn't a point in using a Willow Kick or a Crescent Moon Kick when you can just simply punch a dude 3 times, see them fall, only to punch them 3 more times again. Everything ends up feeling really repetitive. I found myself only doing a few moves despite knowing more, so why use a special combo when the basic combos are just as easy and effective to use? You can definitely feel burned out by the combat after a while, even though it's still entertaining. Again, punching terrorists in the face and hearing those comic book-esque is very amusing. So because of that, I think if you're going to play the game, it would be best to play it in 1 to 2 hour sessions. That way you can still get the amusement out of the punching of dudes, but won't feel burned out in the long run. Anything beyond that 2 hour mark might start to make you feel bored after a while, if I'm quite honest. Oni is a pretty short game anyway. You can probably beat the game in 6 hours, so there's no pressure in trying to hurry up to get through the game. Really, for you to get the best enjoyment out of Oni, just take your time. It's pretty okay. The PS2 version of Oni is definitely a flawed game. The story isn't really all that good, the visuals look pretty bad, and the combat can easily get pretty boring after a while due to how repetitive it can be. In fact, for those reasons, you could probably say that Oni is a mediocre game overall. But at the same time, those flaws also make what is enjoyable about Oni. Yeah, the story is not that well developed, but it's hard to be critical about it when it's also just a pretty fun story for you to just fight and murder terrorists. Yeah, the combat can feel repetitive, but with moderation, you can easily get the most out of the satisfying use of neat combos and awesome weapons, all while dominating various enemy types by just absolutely destroying them. Not only that, but the controls themselves are also really great as well, complementing said combat really well by grouping similar actions together. To me, it would be pretty unfair to call it a bad or even a mediocre game, but I also wouldn't call it great or pretty good either. It's in this weird purgatory of, it okay, but it's still fun, it okay, so there's that. Although I will say, if you are interested in this game, I would probably pick up the PC version of it instead. Really, that change in visuals is important to me. Looking at the PC version, I really dig the environments the game has, with the clean saturation and the vibrant usage of colors. If I played the PC version, I probably would have enjoyed Oni a lot better. The PC version would definitely be in that pretty good fam tier, but it wouldn't hurt to get the PS2 version either. Oni is a fun, enjoyable beat-em-up, and hey, I'm okay with that.